This is Brett Bursey, the director of the Modjeska School for Human Rights. And today we're doing a deeper dive at African history with Dr. Burnett Gallman, one of the board members of the Modjeska School. And this will be available on the Modjeska School archived website if you look for Africa. And it will probably have a longer title than that, but it will certainly be about Africa, Africans, the diaspora, and what we call stolen land and stolen people. Dr. Gallman?
Yes, sir. Yours. Okay, greetings all. Let me go to the PowerPoint here. You know, we live by the PowerPoint these days. And let me close this. Stick that in the corner. So we go to this now. Okay. So we're gonna talk about the history of history and how it affects African people. What is the race card? So often we've been gaslighted to not use the race card when it was thrust upon us. The disclaimer is I'm not a formally trained historian. I'm amateur, but an observer. But I've been studying and observing history steadily for almost half my life. I've been fortunate to have been taught and guided by some of the greatest historical minds ever known, then and now. So this presentation is an hors d'oeuvre intended to provoke thought and stimulate more research. References available. Some of the images that I'm going to show may be disturbing, so y'all be prepared. I use the terms Black, African American, and Hausa interchangeably. Hausa is Africans from the United States of America. I spell the word Africa with a K instead of a C, in keeping with the languages of some African groups which do not have a C in the alphabet. So some of the framing questions that for this lecture: should I accept someone negating my history or deeming it unimportant? Should I accept someone else's interpretation of my history? Should I correct inaccuracies, omissions, and flat out lies in the telling of my history by those other folk? And I would think that these answers are obvious. So these are my objectives. I'm gonna go through that. But also I wanna answer the question that was asked to me at a previous lecture. Why does everything have to be about race? That's the same thing. So understand this is just a few teaspoons and not the whole pitcher of tea. I'm going to, first of all, stake a position about critical race theory, which is a hot thing going on, not taught in schools, grade 1 and 12. And actually, looking at the audience, I don't need to go through this. Racism is so American that racists interpret efforts to understand, study, and eliminate racism as being anti-American propaganda. And frequently when we talk about America living up to the true promise of what they say America was supposed to be like, we're called communists. So that's always very interesting. Hiding Black history is not new. You know, we're talking about it now. It's in all the news, but it's not new. In 1832, Henry Berry, the member of the Virginia House of Delegates, said, and I quote, "We have, as far as possible, closed every avenue by which the light may enter the slave's mind. If we could extinguish the capacity to see the light, our work would be complete. they would then be on the level of beasts of the fields. This is a very telling statement. To me, it shows that this man operated in pure evil because he understood that we were human beings, but he wanted to reduce us even further. And the methodology was to try to prevent, as he put it, light. George Graham Best, who was a U.S. Senator from Missouri, but he also was a state senator in the Confederacy, said, "In all revolutions, the vanquished are the ones who are guilty of treason, even by the historians, for history is written by the victors and framed according to the prejudices and bias existing on their side." The African proverb simplifies all of that and says, until the history of the hunt is told by the lion, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. History is supposed to be a record of past events, but is it true? Or is it a true record, or is it an interpretation based on the writer's opinions? These are some concepts in history. I don't, again, to this audience, I don't have to go through that very much, but perspective is extremely important. Historiography is defined as the study of the writing of history, but is this truthful, accurate, and objective, and truly neutral? And I would say no. So why is history so important? I think Orwell put it real well in his book, 1984. Who controls the past controls the future, and whoever controls the present controls the past. So we have to regain control of our past by getting control of the present. A brilliant scholar at Howard University, Dr. Valethia Watkins, said the control by outsiders over the construction of a people's historical narrative inevitably shapes, influences, and defines what that people will do or fail to do in their own best interest. I think it's very interesting, and I recommend anything that Dr. Valethia Watkins writes and the speeches that she makes. And if you have an opportunity, I think that everyone here would do well to look her up. Another one of people that I can't say was my teacher, but he was also someone who influenced me greatly, was Dr. Anderson Thompson, the man on the left, along with his companion, I don't want to say companion, his co-worker, his partner in intellectual achievement, Dr. Jacob Carruthers. And Dr. Thompson said, the African world is in ideological captivity to those who have taught and trained us to know each other and ourselves by having prescribed for us a history written by our captors. I would add our oppressors and enslavers. The single most important foundation for a people is a thorough understanding of their place of history. And it's our sacred mission to cut through the jungle of lies and distortions surrounding the myth that the Western European whites were the civilizing race of mankind. Dr. Anderson Thompson. Malcolm X, who is one of the people that helped awaken me from what another one of my teachers, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, used to call achieving Negrohood. As long as you're convinced you've never done anything, you can never do anything. So one of the things that when Barbara Derrick and I had a teenage study group, and we would encourage them to read everything, not just African-centered history, but we would encourage them to read all history and read the newspapers. But we would tell them to be careful of all these terms, because this is how these folk get around the BS, may have, maybe, could have been, possibly. but they say that and then they describe whatever they were talking about in authoritative terms. What is Black history? Dr. John Henry Clarke, who also had a profound influence on my life, said that Black history is the missing pages of world history. The question that we should ask then is why are those pages missing? And we should understand that much of our history has been hidden, ignored, changed, or even claimed by others. So what is it about Hausa, Black people in general, that powerful people want to ignore and change? Why do they spend so much time, energy, and money trying to keep us from our history? Do they know something we don't know? We're going to be using a term for the rest of this discussion, the nadir. And the definition of the word nadir is the lowest point. It was first used by Professor Rayford Logan from Howard University to describe the period from the end of Reconstruction until in 1877 through the early 20th century. And he described that as the nadir of race relations at a time when most whites were either consciously or unconsciously racist. And as a result, open racism was accepted in every aspect of life in this country. There are some who believe that just like we may have had a new Reconstruction, that we're getting ready to go through a new nadir. So let me just introduce the American Historical Association. We'll get back to that a little later, which was the first professional historical association in the country. And their website describes them as a, quote, trusted voice, end quote. They were founded in 1884, significantly during the nadir. So what happened during this period we call the nadir? Well, one thing was happening was sundown towns. And these were towns in which Hausa had to leave town before sunset. They existed all over the country, but especially in the South and in the Midwest. We always had to be conscious and aware of these places because not to be aware could be deadly. This was being aware of the race card. Again, that term. And it's said by some, I have not been able to find the documentation, that some sundown towns were formerly all Black towns that were taken over by whites. I'm going to look that up. We even had a sundown state. Oregon in 1844 ordered all Black folk to leave, and those who didn't were going to be punished. Hausa women were given 3 years to leave, and Hausa men were given 2 years to leave. A lot of folks don't realize this. And I had to point out Georgia, especially Forsyth, Georgia, which had a number of lynchings in the earlier 20th century. And they forced most, if not all, Hausa to leave the county. But in 1987, a demonstration of around 75 people against racism was violently attacked by the intensely brave 400 white folk. Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was murdered by policeman Darren Wilson in 2014, was originally a sundown town. At the bottom is a reference of where you can find a lot of this information. And also there's a website, I don't remember the website, but if you Google sundown towns, you can it'll send you to that website that enlarges on this information that's based on James Lowen's work. Lowen actually, for those of you who may remember, wrote a book entitled Lies My Teacher Told Me, which was a very interesting book. Sundown towns in South Carolina, and I have the counties in parentheses, and obviously these are not all of them, but these are the ones that I've been able to document. These are towns in South Carolina where Black folk had to be out by sundown. And what's interesting to me is Folly Beach in Charleston. So American apartheid, we often call it segregation. But why call it something different from what it actually was? It was American apartheid. You had South African apartheid and American apartheid. And I think American apartheid was the prototype. So let's give it its just due. And these are some things that I remember very well when I was growing up. And I was trying to find some other pictures, but the picture on the left, when I was growing up and we went to the movie theater, we were always forced to sit in the balcony. Now, fortunately, in Hartsville, the stairs were indoors, so we weren't necessarily exposed to the elements. But we frequently had a lot of very, very nasty surprises waiting for us as we left, especially at night. Lynching happened during the nadir, and before and after, actually. It was entertainment for many people. Lynchings were acts of terrorism. And despite calls for anti-lynching laws as early as 1898, a law against lynching wasn't passed until 2021, 2022, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. Between 1977 and 1950, there were more than 4,000 lynchings in 12 southern states. 185 of these were in South Carolina. The states with the most lynchings were Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and Arkansas, followed by Alabama, Texas, and Florida. These figures are very well available in the Equal Justice Initiative's publication, Lynching in America. We cannot mention lynching without mentioning this revered sister, Ida B. Wells Burnett, who really does not get the attention that she should get. She was born enslaved in Holly Springs. She actually started calling for anti-lynching laws in 1898, but again, they weren't enacted until 2022, 124 years later. She was multi-genius, much like many of the people of that day had to be. She was a journalist, she was an educator, she was a newspaper editor, she was a women's rights activist, and a civil rights activist. She published a lot of pamphlets, and as a matter of fact, her anti-lynching pamphlets almost got her killed. One of her friends in Memphis, where she lived at that time, was lynched, and she printed some pamphlets, and they came to kill her and to lynch her. And she got out of her office just in time, but they burned it down. She was a contemporary of and worked with Frederick Douglass, Mary McLeod Bethune, Marcus Garvey, Monroe Trotter, W.B. Du Bois, and Madam C.J. Walker. Names that many people are more familiar with, but we should also know this awesome, awesome lady. She wrote a pamphlet attacking the exclusion of IOSA from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. She helped found the Niagara Movement, which was the precursor of the NAACP. She helped found the National Association of Colored Women, but lost the election for president to Mary McLeod Bethune, who is now identified with that organization. So lynching occurred during the nadir. The picture on the right is often calls out to me because you look at those faces of those people, men and women and children. They don't seem disturbed in the least. What is a culture that allows for this to be all right? Lynching. Look at the faces. They're proud, actually proud of what they've done. And they lynch women. I think most folk should know the story of Mary Turner, who was lynched because she complained that they lynched her husband. And not only did they lynch her, she was pregnant, they cut her belly open and killed her unborn baby. What kind of people are these? Or are they people at all? Now, even though there's a new knowledge of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, you know, everybody talks about Black Wall Street. We should understand that there were many, many deadly race riots perpetrated by white folk. Many were either unreported or lied about. Here are a few of them after this. Black Wall Street grew from more than 10,000 in 1910 to 100,000 in 1920. During that riot, 300 plus people were killed, 800 plus people were injured. And I put plus because we have to depend on some of the people who perpetrated the atrocity to tell us what happened. 35 city blocks were destroyed that included 1,200 homes. The total damages in today's money was much more than 150 million. Not a single white person was arrested. The R&B group that many of us like a whole lot, the Gap Band, was from Tulsa, and their name was named after 3 streets on Black Wall Street: Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, the Gap Band. Black Wall Street before, Black Wall Street after. These race riots were massacres, basically, caused by a combination of jealousy, greed, fear, and voter intimidation, voter suppression that was served on a racist bed of white narcissistic pseudo-supremacy. Now, although these massacres frequently targeted Iosa, there are recorded incidents of massacres of Native Americans, and that's a whole lecture in and of itself. But Chinese people were massacred, Mexicans, and even white Catholics. Although in modern times, the term race riot conjures images of the urban rebellions of the 1960s and 70s, the true race riots were massacres of Iosa by whites. Again, a short list of these race riots follows. I'm going to put the number of Iosa people who were killed, but please understand that there were whites killed during many of these too. But those numbers were usually falsely made to look much less than they actually were. 1863 in New York, 120 dead. Memphis, Tennessee in 1866, 46 Iosa dead. New Orleans, 1866, 150 massacred. St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, in 1868, 250 Iosa massacred. St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, 1868, 100 Iosa killed. Camilla, Georgia, 1868, 15 Iosa. Opelousas, Louisiana, 150. Colfax, Louisiana, 150. Vicksburg, Mississippi, 1874, about 300. There's more. Clinton, Mississippi, 50 Iosa dead. Hamburg, South Carolina, 1876, more than 6 Hausa dead. Ellington, South Carolina, 1876, more than 100 Hausa dead. Thibodaux, Louisiana. Wilmington, North Carolina, and I'll mention more about that. In 1898, more than 300 dead, and actually it was many, many more than 300. Atlanta, Georgia, 1906. Springfield, Illinois, 1908. Slocum, Texas. There's more. East St. Louis. These are race riots, folks. Longview, Texas. Chicago, Illinois. Charleston, South Carolina. Washington, D.C. Elaine, Arkansas. Ocoee, Florida. And then you have Black Wall Street. Then we have Rosewood, Florida. There was a movie made about Rosewood that a lot of the actual survivors really complained about because they inserted a great white hope, a great white savior in Rosewood. And race riots continue. Orangeburg and massacre in 1968, Philadelphia, 11 Hausa. Charleston, we know about that. Now, what is not said is in most of these massacres, Hausa did fight back and weren't docile. We were not just sitting around waiting for them to come and get us. This was not reported by the mainstream. And many white folks were not only killed, but many were injured. Again, the reasons for most of these were jealousy of our economic success, attempts at land grabs. One of my great uncles, I'm convinced, was lynched. He was a big landowner and he owned a successful business in Pickens, South Carolina. And they found him hanging from his barn. And right after the smoke settled, his wife had lost everything. 1919 was so horrendous that the summer months have been called the Red Summer because of the bloodlust and violence. The death rates, again, were unreported and the displacement and loss of property incalculable. Now, one thing about Tulsa, this was the first time that bombs were dropped on American citizens. The other time was when a so-called black mayor in Philadelphia authorized bombing of the MOVE organization in 1985. The Wilmington massacre was the only successful coup d'etat that resulted in the successful violent overthrow of a legally elected government on American soil. They tried it again, but it didn't work. Now, all these atrocities had several things in common, including blaming the victims. Historians and journalists taught, and if you read about it now, that the Wilmington massacre was caused by violent Hausa. Now, back to the American Historical Association. When the AHA was founded, white Southerners and Northerners were in the process of reuniting after the Civil War at the expense of Black folk. They call it the Wormley Agreement or the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. This marked the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the atrocities of the nadir. Now, the American Historical Association in 1913 had their annual meeting in Charleston, South Carolina, and it was decided there that they would teach about the events of Reconstruction as a failed effort and would portray the Hausa legislators as uncouth, illiterate, unintelligent, immoral, and dishonest buffoons, even though they were the opposite. This effort was known as the Dunning School. Who was Dunning? William Archibald Dunning of Columbia University has been called the father of historiographic racism. His students spread this falsehood to many universities and colleges, Yale, Ohio State, Bryn Mawr, Chicago, Duke, well, it was Trinity College then, LSU, and the lie became standard. According to an African proverb, a lie has many variations, the truth has none. And Joseph Goebbels, who was the chief propagandist for the Nazi Party, said, if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes the truth. And that is what has happened. The Dunning School still exists today, and it's the true feel-good history. I remember when they first started coming at Baba Asa Hilliard and Dr. Leonard Jeffries, and they call African-centered thought feel-good history. But the Dunning School was feel-good history. And it's in part driving the current anti-CRT furor. And these falsehoods were accepted by truth by most white folk and some Hausa, including educator Booker T. Washington, although there is some evidence to suggest that he just publicly acted like he agreed. But historian George Washington Williams actually also published some anti-Black stuff. These ahistorical lies were attacked and countered by doctors Mary McLeod Bethune, J.W.E. Bowen, Ralph Bunche, W.B. Du Bois, James Diggs, Althurus Ambush Taylor, one of my favorite historians because of his work, but also because of his name. Charles Wesley, Anna Julia Cooper, Monroe Work, who not enough is known about. This man was brilliant. And Carter G. Woodson. Because mainstream publishers refused to publish the rebuttals, Woodson created his own publishing company, Associated Publishers, and he organized the Journal of Negro History and the Negro History Bulletin as vehicles for the truth. The University of South Carolina used to have the whole issue, all the issues of Journal of Negro History. And I used to go down there with $30, $40, $50 in coins and copy different articles. Those of you who may have been in Temple this morning, that's where I got a lot of the information that I used to give my patients when I thought that they would need to read something. That and some other publications. Black Books Bulletin was another excellent source. Negro History Bulletin was also created by Carter G. Woodson. And he also founded with others the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915, still striving and thriving and doing well. Ida Wells Barnett, William Monroe Trotter, William Jefferson White, and John Hope Franklin were also opponents of the lie. Other lies and liars. In 1919, the Sons of Confederate Veterans adopted a document by a Miss Mildred Rutherford of Athens, Georgia, who was a historian general of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And her book was titled A Measuring Rod for Textbook, that tested textbooks and library books to see if they were unjust to the South. Now, my homeboy and one of my favorite writers, Michael Harriot, who was the nephew of one of my best friends growing up and in adulthood until his transition, wrote an article that traced Mildred Rutherford's pedigree. And I have to say, I don't remember it, but I think it was, I'm not sure where he did it, but I want to see if I can find that and put it together because I think it's very, very interesting and instructive. So they were willing to lie. And some of the main points, she said the U.S. Constitution of 1787 was a compact between sovereign states and was not perpetual. This is the standard states' rights. She said that to secede was not a rebellion, just like the attempt to take over Congress was not violent. Said the North was responsible for the Civil War, even though the first shots were fired here in South Carolina. The enslaved Africans were not mistreated in the South, and the North was responsible for their presence. And there were the Andersonville was a horrible prison that really mistreated their inmate, the prisoners of war. Said the South has never had its rightful place in literature. This is a textbook that I was taught out of in school, the New Sims History of South Carolina. My mother had two of them. I actually recently sent one to my good friend, Greg Carr, as a gift so he could see in real time some of the stuff. Mary Sims Oliphant was came from a family of historical liars. And I'm not going to go over this, but if you ever get a chance to look at it, it's awesome. So we're going to deal with some misleading topics. Misleading topic number one was the whiteness of Kemet. I'm not going to go into this in any detail because this was the topic of my very first lecture in here. So, but what I want to do is to talk about some of the giants. Now, Egyptology was founded by Europeans from their perspective of what those civilizations were. However, we find out that Egypt itself is a word that was a Greek invention, and that the people there called themselves Kemetiu, and that country Kemet, which means the black land and the black people. The father of Kemetology is Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop on the left, who is a Senegalese scholar who was a multi-genius. He was not only a historian and anthropologist, but he was also a nuclear physicist. And the thing about him was he got a PhD at the Sorbonne, but they forced him to write his thesis 3 times before they finally gave it to him. And each one of those theses is available now as a book that is eye-opening. And he, along with Dr. Theophile Obenga, who I've had the blessing to be able to sit down with and talk to and pick his brain. His student, Dr. Obenga, Dr. Diop and Dr. Obenga attended a conference, they call it the Cairo Conference in Egypt, and proved without a doubt that the ancient Egyptians, contrary to what was being taught at that time, had to be Black. And he proved it from several different ways that I covered in my lecture on Egypt. To the right is Dr. Yosef Ben Yakinen, who had led study tours to Egypt for almost 40, I think more than 40 years. I'm not gonna do that. Misleading topic number 2, slavery saved Africans from savagery and barbarism. Now, what's interesting is that if you read the diaries of the first Europeans and Muslims to visit West and Central Africa, they encountered advanced civilizations and great educational systems and universities and peaceful people. My lecture, I do a lecture that I plan to do for this course, the African origin of medical science, in which I showed that medical science was well advanced in Africa long before many of the principles that we now take for granted were accepted by Europeans. Misleading topic number 3, abolitionists and liberal whites. You know, abolitionists have been painted as allies and friends of the enslaved Africans. and free Africans, as Baba Joe Benton, my brother, used to say. They weren't free; they're just loose in a habitat. And even though these abolitionists were against slavery, it didn't mean that they were accepted as social, political, or even biological equals. Most of these abolitionists were white pseudo-supremacists or white narcissists. And most felt that Africans were uncivilized brutes who could only be redeemed by adopting white culture. Dr. King recognized this, and in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, said it very, very well. I'm not going to read that. I have a couple of quotes that he made about liberal whites. Now, misleading topic number 4, Frederick Douglass versus Henry Highland Garnet. Before going into that, I think that I should at least introduce the topic of the Negro Convention movement. The non-enslaved Africans used to get together and have conferences or conventions in which they would discuss some of the issues of the day and try to come up with a consensus of how they should be approached by their people. And the very first, I forget the year, but the very first of these conferences was held in Philadelphia by Richard Allen, who became the bishop, the first bishop and organizer of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church. And it was interesting because I grew up in the AME Church, and it was so interesting that we had an organization they called the Allen Christian Endeavor League, the ACE League. And as I grew into this knowledge, I think most AMEs would really be shocked to find out that their beloved Richard Allen was a Pan-African nationalist. That's often something that I'd love to do one day. But there were a lot of people involved, and some of those names are names that we should all know, but they were generally divided into 2 groups. You had the assimilationists or integrationists, and you had the nationalists. And one of the champions of the integrationist assimilationist was Frederick Douglass. One of his major opponents was Henry Highland Garnet. Now, I would bet $1 to a donut that most folk don't know who Henry Highland Garnet was. But he was actually one of my heroes, he and his good friend, Martin Delany. Henry Highland Garnet was a Presbyterian minister who was very, very, very radical, not radical. He was the one that said that we can't be no much worse. We need to agitate and take our freedom. We can't wait for them to give it to us. In my last book, I did a brief bio of him, but in the book Slave Culture, that is an excellent biography of Henry Highland Garnet. And they used to bump heads on a lot of things. First, we should know that Frederick Douglass was a favorite of the prominent white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. So he was featured in history books and newspapers and was well known, which is why we all know about Frederick Douglass. And at one time it said that Douglass declared, quote, slavish devotion, end quote, to Garrison. But so, as interesting as that may seem, Frederick Douglass at that time was not the most popular leader among the Hausa people. The most popular leaders were people like Henry Highland Garnet and Martin Delany. So what were some of the topics that they bumped heads on? Douglass felt that white folks should be able to participate in the discussions and debates at the Negro Convention movement, where Garnett said that we appreciate any help that we can get, but they need to work with their own people because that's where the problem lies. And he said that whenever white folks were around, that Black folk may not be honest. Douglass favored moral suasion, saying that enslavers would realize the error of their ways and make things right. Whereas Garnett said, we need to get armed and go in and take our freedom. Douglass felt that abolition was not political and politicians should avoid the debate, whereas Garnett said that it was a political thing. Douglass said he didn't believe in immigration outside of the US, whereas Garnett said embraced the idea of immigration and actually organized the African Civilization Society. What is ironic is that toward the end of his life, Douglass embraced and appropriated all of Delaney's positions. And just parenthetically, Garnett rescued and republished David Walker's Appeal, a book that so scared enslavers that they banned the book and ordered a bounty for David Walker's life. So we have Henry Highland Garnett to thank for our familiarity with David Walker's Appeal, which I think is necessary reading for everybody. Misleading topic number 5, ignoring Martin Robertson Delaney, who was a very well-respected physician, author, journalist, soldier, politician, novelist, ethnologist, and is considered to be the father of Black nationalism. He was very popular among Hausa people, but has been ignored by most mainstream historians, skin folk and non-skin folk. It's ironic that Delaney had his own newspaper in Pittsburgh called The Mystery, and he stopped publishing it when he was convinced and I guess seduced by Frederick Douglass to help with his publication. And as you might imagine, they soon became at odds. There's a lot to unpack on that, and I invite people to please, again, these are teaspoons, this is not the picture. Misleading topic number 6, Booker T. Washington versus William Monroe Trotter. Again, we all know about Booker T. Washington, but very few people know who William Monroe Trotter was. And I think that he deserves attention. So most folk are aware of the beef that Washington had with W.B. Du Bois, the public beef, but very few people are aware of William Monroe Trotter. He was also a co-founder of the Niagara Movement and NAACP. He was a newspaper man who co-created a newspaper in Boston called The Guardian. And one of the things that The Guardian did was attack Booker T. Washington constantly. William Monroe Trotter was the first Black Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Harvard, and he was the first and only Black man who was forcibly ejected from the White House after he had a verbal confrontation with Woodrow Wilson. And because of Washington's influence, Washington did a speech in Boston, and William Monroe Trotter organized demonstrators, and they were heckling him. And actually, he ended up getting arrested for heckling Booker T. Washington. Other misleading topic, when did Africans first come to America? Now, the first Africans of which we have evidence in North America arrived in North America around 800 before the Christian era. And this is more than 2,000 years before Columbus got lost and stumbled on the Hispaniola in the Caribbean. Now, the first enslaved Africans that we have evidence of were brought to the eastern coastal part of what's now South Carolina by the Spanish in 1526, not 1619. And this was also the first known slave revolt and the first known maroon colony in America. Black inventors and scientists. I'm not going to go over these because websites will do this, but I saw a very clever meme the other day that said, okay, if you want Black folk to leave, we're going to take all our contributions. And they started listing all of these things that Black folk had invented and pioneered. Black cowboys. I also made up more than 25%. Some people say as many as 40% of so-called cowboys in the West, even though Westerns on TV rarely portrayed them. And I was growing up, I was always a big fan of Westerns, but my mother I used to root for the Indians all the time when rather than the cowboys. And I look back on that and I wonder why that is, because I didn't have any other information, but I did. And some notable Hausa cowboys are listed here. Bash Reeves was believed to be the original Lone Ranger on which that character was based. Now, this is something that can be debated. The Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement are frequently lumped together and conflated. Now, admittedly, the Black Power movement came out of the Civil Rights Movement. And Malcolm X called them both human rights movements. And my brother, Bobby Derrick Jackson, said that human rights was the principle, while civil rights and Black Power were the tactics. The demonstrations and cultural tensions of these movements were actually strategies. Now, as an aside, the Urban Dictionary defines these movements differently. The Civil Rights Movement is defined by the Urban Dictionary as a movement during the 1950s and 60s that involved the pursuance of equal treatment of Blacks and whites in America. The Black Power movement is defined as, quote, a call for separatism that is no different in result to white power, Asian power, Indian power, Egyptian power, or queer power. Separatism is the main cause of racial tensions, yet many people seem blissfully unaware of this ho-hum, end quote. Again, this is information that's out there supposedly posing as an authority. Now, although urban infers Black, the Urban Dictionary was written by a white California Polytechnic State University computer science by the name of Aaron Peckham in 1999 as a parody of various dictionaries, but it has about 65 million visitors monthly. Now, some differences in the Civil Rights Movement, the major organizations were the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Congress of Racial Equality, and initially the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Black Power movement, major organizations were, and this is where some people disagree, and I'm just going to continue with this because one of, and I forget her name, there was a sister who was part of that, the Republican New Africa and the Black Panther Party, who used to give a yearly lecture at the Black Social Workers Conference, in which, and her book is actually one of the references that I use, but I can't think of her name. But she said that there were revolutionary nationalists, which were the Republican New Africa and the Black Panther Party, and the cultural nationalists, which are the US organization, ASCAC, and NABSW. The tactics of the civil rights movement with marches, boycotts, protests, civil disobedience, sit-ins, wait-ins, etc. Whereas Black Power movement tactics were confrontation politics, Pan-African philosophy, cultural expressions, and publishing. And it's interesting that the people in the revolutionary movements of the Black Power movement were killed off, just like the Panthers were just assassinated. Whereas many people in the cultural nationalist organization became educated and actually began to head up college. They became college professors, so that a lot of that still exists. Now, there are other ignored topics. Many people have been led to believe that Africans never won anything, any confrontation against Europeans, which is patently untrue. I remember I was first introduced to that by Dr. Amos Wilson, a brilliant psychologist, who said in one of his speeches that we must realize that our enemy can be defeated. Other ignored topics are slave revolts, maroon colonies, African organizations and institutions. Another lecture that I have is that I plan to give is a lecture dealing with the methodologies of resistance that we used. So after hearing this, I think that hopefully I've been able to give everyone an answer is, why is everything to IUSA about race? Because that has been the way that it was all this time. So I'm going to plug my books and open it up for questions and concerns. Not everybody at one time.
The picture that you showed earlier about the lynching.
Yes, sir.
One of those pictures contains a picture that I'm well familiar with, but he has the gentleman that was being burned.
Yes.
He has a surviving member of his family right here in Columbia, South Carolina.
I'm sorry, my phone was going off. Say that again, please, sir.
That gentleman that was lynched has a surviving family member right here in Columbia.
Oh.
He teaches with me at Benedict College. He's
I would love to speak with him.
Yeah, his name is Professor Wendell Brown. He teaches in the art department with me.
Okay.
An uncle on that slab.
Okay.
But they are from Virginia.
Okay.
The other thing is, my ex-wife's grandfather escaped a race riot in Wilmington, North Carolina, and there's a new film out about it now called Wilmington on Fire. They have the names of the people who are guilty of doing that. They found that information.
Okay. All right. Mr. Reed, I see your hand. Unmute, please.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm a student of military history, and one of my favorite movies is Zulu, which is about the Battle of Rorke's Drift during the British campaign against the Zulus. And I just thought it was a remarkable piece of history that everybody should know, realizing that few people are as much of a historian of military things as I am. But I was confounded when I was dealing with the Military Magnet Academy in the heights of North Charleston, which is a magnet school with a military dress code, uniforms, junior ROTC, and all this. And right in the office was this huge, and I'm talking 4 by 5 foot copy of a British artist rendering of the Battle of Rorke's Drift. And I just noted, I just noted to the principal that I think that it's funny that of all the things that military magnet, which was probably 90% African American, would represent, would be to have this picture in the front office, which was the poster child for imperialism and African domination. And I suggested strongly that maybe they should remove it and get another Zulu painting or something to replace it. But after 2 years, when COVID came in, they hadn't have done it. So apparently the irony of that had no real effect on them. But I just think you talk about representing.
Yeah, it's interesting. That movie was widely panned by the Zulu people. And it's very interesting. I think the king of the Zulus at that time was someone named Cetewayo, or I forget how to pronounce his name. But he learned much of what he knew from his grandfather, who was Shaka. Shaka was and as a matter of fact, as I understand, and I'm not a military historian, but from what I understand, many of the military maneuvers that Shaka used are still studied in some military circles.
Yes.
And it's interesting that that just happened in Southern Africa, but Africans were beating their colonizers all over Africa. The thing that made the difference was the Maxim gun.
Yeah. Maxim
gun enabled them to kill at a distance with it was a fully automatic gun. And so the Maxim gun actually made the difference. One of the biggest defeats, I think, that has been celebrated was in Ethiopia, the Battle of Adwa, where the Ethiopian army defeated the Italians. But again, all over Africa, there are repeated episodes of Africans winning. Someone that I like to claim as my ancestor, Njinga, from what is now Angola, waged ultimately unsuccessful, but while she lived, a successful guerrilla warfare against the Portuguese. So the fact is that they were beatable. They were just more wedded to death, domination, and destruction than Africans were.
Well, I think it's interesting that Shaka Zulu, even after the victory at Isalawana and a few other smaller ones, and then a string of very costly, in terms of high casualties, of young African warriors, basically came to the conclusion that given the profusion of the Gatling type machine guns, the Maxims, and the bolt action rifles, and of course the precision drill, which was so indicative of Zulu, that he couldn't sacrifice the flower of Zulu manhood for further losses in the campaign, which in my mind, was a gigantic sort of thought in terms of the long view. And I will say that Zulu being one thing, Rorke's Drift, Zulu Dawn, which is the Battle of Vaisalawana, really shows the Zulu victory in full flush, and I love that movie too. I'm done.
Yeah. I actually have both those movies in my collection. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, Doc, I have one.
Hey, my brother, how you doing, man?
Fine, what's going on?
When you go invite me back?
You have a standing invitation.
Okay.
I'll
Put you on
email
the
you.
spot.
I'll email because I would love to have you come on.
To everybody, Don Frierson is a very, very popular radio host here in Columbia. And he and I did a weekly show in which we discussed topics like this for more than 25 years.
Yep.
Yep.
My question is, though, today we see African Americans under attack in the form of book bannings, questions about African American history not being taught in schools, and the lies they tell about critical race theory. I was just curious as to what lessons can we learn from the past to deal with the situations that we have now, and to perhaps put up a guarded effort for the future, if you understand what I'm saying.
I do. And at the very first part, I think probably before you were able to get on, I discussed those things. But one of the things that I think is very, very important is that we should not, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, I don't think we need to wait for someone else to accept our history. I think that venues like this, and again, I applaud my brother Brett Bursey for putting this together, because I think that it's necessary that that everyone be exposed. But I think that it is our duty to educate ourselves. Now, how we present that is certainly up to the presenter. But I don't think that Don, if you remember, and I know Baba remembers years ago when the South Carolina first, and I forget the year, it was in the 1980s or early 1990s, when South Carolina passed those laws saying that they were going to infuse, that was the word then, Black history into the curriculum. And our study group bogarted our way onto the committee that was tasked to do that. And at that point, I realized that even if, I realized a couple of things. Number one is the accepted history of Black folk that would have been infused was either false, sterile, or total BS, number one. And number two, once it was infused, there was no way of controlling how the teachers taught it. So that there were some teachers that, and we ran programs every summer for 3 summers, and the teachers were given grad school hours for just attending. And many teachers looked at that as an opportunity for a paid vacation with graduate credits. And they had no intention of teaching this. So I think that is something that we in the AUSA community need to take care of ourselves, and in venues like this. Does that answer your question, Don?
Yeah, one of the things I've mentioned on my program, I don't know if you remember, years ago when you were conducting classes out at the frat house,
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
would come on every,
yeah, we had a
every,
Saturday school.
yeah, and every week we would do that, recreate that on the air every week.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think, you know, we as people who have access to the media and reaching Black people, you know, we need to learn from you and take those lessons and put it out there as we've always done.
I appreciate that, but I have learned from other folks, so I can't accept any credit for doing that, because I stand on shoulders that are so high that I had to climb to get up there.
Well, I learned from them by way of you and Listerville, so.
Okay. But Listerville was my, even though he was younger than me, he was my big brother.
Yeah. Thanks, Doc.
Thank you, Don. Good to see you. I saw your brother the other day.
Oh, yeah, he didn't tell me.
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
Any other questions? Comments? Concerns? Criticisms?
Doc, I got an observation, a question, that your list of, I'm just going to use the term liberal versus radical in terms of the Black Power work. You didn't have the Southern Negro Youth Congress on the right side of that column, and was that because that was a new player to bring into the thing?
Yeah, that Southern Youth Congress, I think, if I'm not mistaken, was organized in the 1940s.
Well, it started in 39 and was pretty well dead by 1940, after the Birmingham Conference in 48. The big one was the one in Columbia in 46, but it was again another example of the more pointed the organizing is, the more militant the organizing is, more likely they are to get smashed by the federal government.
Yeah, and I think my father was involved in the one in Columbia.
Cool.
And it's interesting because it blows people's mind when they find out that the featured speakers were W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, both of whom are heroes.
Yeah.
Of mine. Yeah.
Adam Clayton Powell was scheduled to speak there, and he didn't make it, and it was still not quite sure why.
Okay, I didn't know that. That's good to know. Yeah. Any other questions?
We do need to let people know that we have a schedule of activities that are happening at our new building next door to the Modjeska house.
Okay.
And this is the 8th year of the Modjeska School that's now kind of in mid-session. And Dr. Adams, who is with us this evening, matriculated, I think, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And we've got some current students in the room. And the things that we're doing on Sunday are always open to the public. They're like extra credit for the students, but they're things that are specifically deeper dives than we go into during it's like 20 classes that lift up the highlights of history, where we connect those dots to understand the continuity of the enemy and the continuity of the allies. And this next deep dive on Sunday is the 21st of this month, 2 Sundays from now, with Cecil Williams. And there's the Scarred Justice movie is a redone film about the Orangeburg Massacre. And of course, everybody, I'm sure, Zooming with us tonight knows who Cecil Williams is. And he's just an amazing gentleman who has really turned the corner in getting support for his Civil Rights Museum. But he took pictures of everything, and he's going to be with us Sunday, the 21st from 4 to 6. And anybody wants to be on that, just let me know, and we'll get you the Zoom link.
I see Mr. Reed's hand up again.
Dr. Gallman, I have to sort of admit something, but I want to put it out there for your comment and debate from your perspective. I took my first Black history course in 1968, And in my subsequent studies, et cetera, since then, I have come to believe that for me personally, being having a degree in history and an avocation in history, that the more African American history I studied, the more things that I was exposed to, the more I felt that Black history was like the other complementary part of my history that had always been suppressed. But I think that's probably not something that you would necessarily agree with or that other people would support. So if you could just comment on my perspective and whether you think that's valid or very invalid.
Well, one of the quotations that I used earlier was from one of my teachers who, Dr. Adams, Barbara Derrick, and I know Don Frierson are extremely familiar with, and Barbara Sayatu was Dr. John Henry Clark when he said Black history is the missing pages of world history. And the fact is that I would venture to guess, and this is a wild guess, that the Black history that you got in the 1960s may not have been as accurate or as powerful because it was probably watered down. Now, I could be wrong, but but my guess is that what was palatable in 1968 is what they're trying to run away from now.
Well, my textbook for that course happened to have on the cover Frederick Douglass. And from your perspective, that might give you some insight.
Yeah, if you're, now there's a book, a history book that was widely used by an excellent historian, John Hope Franklin, called From Slavery to Freedom. And that book it is a good history book, but my problem is that it starts at the lowest point of a people instead of starting at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And so that it doesn't, another thing that Dr. Clark said is, and I'm paraphrasing, if you start your history with slavery, everything that happened afterwards seems like an improvement. So so I would bet $1 to a donut that the Black history offered in the 1960s tended to be a little bit watered down and more acceptable. Brett, I see a comment from a brother in another organization that I'm in asking if this lecture could be put on another website, Facebook page.
Yes, that he came in late. We're doing something that's in addition to what we've been doing, which is doing separate courses that go beyond just the class that we've been having, that we've been calling the Modjeska School. There was never any intention that the Modjeska School was just going to be the same class over and over again. And so Dr. Gallman brings a wealth of knowledge, and we're capturing it, and it will be posted at the Modjeska School website. And it will be able to have its own portfolio on African history, and it's a longer title than just African history. But yes, it will be available, and certainly is all worth watching again. So the best way to find out is to at least go to the Progressive Network website and get on the e-list. We don't send out a whole lot, but scpronet.com, SC like South Carolina, Pronet like Progressive Network, scpronet.com gets you to our website where you can click and jump to the Modjeska School or some of the other projects. And if you do that, then you'll know what we're doing when we're doing it. You're welcome to come.
Okay. And I want to thank my brother Theodore Lush, all the way from Alabama. We keep each other apprised of a lot of different things going on, and we share a lot of information. So I want to thank him for being here. Good to see you, brother.
Thanks, Dr. Gallman. I've been experiencing a whole lot of technical difficulty with this laptop of mine, and it got me in late, but it got me in. But thank you for the invitation, and I am always open for this, and I'm just a phone call or email or text message away, sir.
Thank you, my brother. And I also want to,
Dr. Gallman.
yes, hey, how you doing, my sister?
Good and you.
I look forward to all your posts on Facebook, especially the ones with the pictures.
Gratitude, gratitude, gratitude. I'm learning from you as well. I'm learning from you. And I always say I'm a constant student. And you did share some things that I need to be aware of and learn. And just wanted to know what skills are important into learning history. You know, I'm not an expert in history. I didn't go to school for history. But what are a couple skills that you could share to help someone who I want to know history and I want to read, I want to be aware of history because I deal with the community. What are one or two skills you could share to help me understand it? And the different, and what I tell you, what I appreciate about what you're teaching, what you taught tonight, was that there's different perspectives of Black history that we don't know about. Nowhere did I know. I mean, I didn't grow up learning about Garrett. I mean, really, so like, man, what is the inspiration in learning or a skill to learn about history and understanding that you taught me that history is hidden deliberately. They will not tell you this in school, period. So a person that's outside of the school system, what skill or some type of inspiration that I need to have to be aware of this wide range of history that is here and that's not told?
Well, I'm going to first give my opinions, and then I'm going to ask someone I consider to be an expert and a expert teacher to chime in. But first of all, you have to be interested. Secondly, you need to have good teachers or good people that you can go to for information. One of the things that I did was, as I mentioned, I used to go to the University of South Carolina library and spend literally hours and spend sometimes up to $100 photocopying articles from Black-centered magazines like Black Books Bulletin, Negro History Bulletin, Journal of Negro History, and there was there was another one whose name escapes me that John Johnson did before Jet. And I would copy articles from that and share it with folk. That's where I started. But I'd like to ask Dr. Adams, if you don't mind, as a professional historian, would you add some substance to that answer?
Nana Bernie, I would only be adding just a few things to what you said, but Sister Jonica, I would say that, start with the things that you are interested in, because that interest that Nana Bernie mentioned, you already have interest, right? And so you start with the things that you're already passionate about, And I think when I think about even just some of your skills in terms of, ecology, like you could just start to branch out and think about like who are the people in our history who were immersed in these things that some of them may have been lost. And so you may be able to give us a presentation on some of those things that we're no longer aware of in regards to how we used to make ample use of our environment, especially with so little, but even down to the plots and ways in which we would supplement our diet and how people are getting back to that again. You could roll that back. And I would just add, in addition to starting with your own passion and interest, is the study group process. Some of that is what the Progressive Network is doing around the Citizenship School. But there are, I think particularly because of Zoom and the pandemic, there are lots of people that are able to engage in the slow reading of text, but in community, and so some of that also helps with the remembering of a lot of these things, and then making those connections is not just to read or not just to do that in isolation, but to do that in community, because I think that deepens our learning. It certainly deepens my learning, even when it comes to things that I'm already familiar with. It's the community that regrounds me in those things. So I think that's what I would add. Thank you, Nana Bernie.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Gratitude. Thank you.
I just saw a question by Barbara Derrick asking one of those Barbara Derrick questions. And the question is it a diminishment to call what was created in Oklahoma Black Wall Street? Yeah.
Dr. Gallman, let me add something that for my perspective for Jonica's question is that I'm really using the term that King used. And King, I think, was a lot more militant than he let on. But King called for a radical revolution of values.
Yes.
And so the reason that we want to study history is because the winners wrote it. Okay. So history is a recitation of the winners' values. And the mission of the winners is to maintain their status quo. And I'll guarantee you that the rich white European guys that have been running the show don't share the values of the regular people that aren't rich white European guys. And so we have this commonality of values that we need to uncover by learning our shared history of oppression and struggle. And so that's a real serious part of the Modjeska School.
Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns, criticisms? If not, I guess that's that, Brett.
This is that, but we will keep, I think that we can capture the emails of people that were here to certainly let them know the next time that Dr. Gallman has a deeper dive, and keep everyone posted. And they can go to scprenet.com and get on our e-list. Thank you for coming.
Y'all be safe.
Thank you, Dr. Gallman.
Thank you, Dr. Gallman.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you.